Now, after weeks of wrangling, the government's Brexit bill has finally passed through Parliament, allowing EU regulations to transfer into British law when we leave the European Union. But the Prime Minister, Theresa May, had to offer a compromise deal to ensure that Tory rebels voted against a Lord's amendment, which would have given MPs the power to block Brexit if there was no deal with the EU. While the Labour MP, Naz Shah, was also seen being pushed through the Commons in a wheelchair with a sick bucket in her lap in order to vote against the government. Her colleagues have accused Tory whips of an utter lack of humanity and compassion after they decided not to abide by a convention which would have allowed her to vote from a car in the courtyard. Let's get some more on this, shall we now? Joining us is the Guardian columnist, Owen Jones, and also the Spectator's political correspondent, Katy. Great to see you both on the programme this morning. Katy, let's start with you. And let's start with those images of Naz Shah. What did you make of the fact that she was not only prized from a hospital bed to vote, but had to go through the chamber to do it?
I think it was definitely a very bad look for the Conservative Party, the way it played out. But I think it goes to something a bit, deeper than just party politics, which is just the structure of Parliament. So the fact that we had MPs such as Jo Swinson also, who is 2 days overdue currently on her pregnancy, she had to come in and vote. And although there is a pairing system, I think something maybe needs to be looked at, and whether it's really something that is sustainable, is to have a system by which people need to come in sickness and, in severe pregnancy.
Owen, what do you think? Does it show just how tight it was and how nervous the government were?
I think it was gross. I think it's pretty disgusting, actually. I mean, what seems to have happened is the government felt that, they were almost trying to call the bluff of sick and pregnant MPs, that they hoped they wouldn't turn up to vote against the government. And, I think if you look at the moment, the Conservative Party, which a few years ago accepted, at least in rhetoric, that it had a severe branding problem and had to detoxify itself. And we've got everything from a backbench Tory MP, Christopher Chope, who stopped the criminalisation of men taking photos of women's skirts.
Yeah,
and then
we have
talk
the government... about that in a minute.
Then we've got
Brexit.
Then we've got the government dragging in sick and pregnant women MPs in the hope that they're so sick or they're so late stage in their pregnancies that they won't vote against the government. I mean, it's horrendous behaviour. OK,
Katy, back to the EU withdrawal bill. Theresa May got the vote that she wanted, and not surprisingly, both sides claiming victory. Who do you think it's a victory for?
I think, given how positive number 10 sound today, and given how bullish the Brexiteers sound, and also how annoyed the Labour rebels are that the Tory rebels didn't go with them, I do think it seems like the Brexiteers have the slight upper hand here. This compromise, it isn't clear that it is such a win for the Remainers. I think that the option of a no-deal Brexit still looks quite difficult to bring about, but I don't think it's completely off the table. And I think for lots of these Remain rebels, or would-be Tory Remain rebels, the whole aim was to take that off the table completely as an option, and I don't think they've succeeded there.
Owen, Dominic Grieve, a very vocal rebel, we interviewed him many times here on Sky News, ended up voting against his own amendment. What do you make of his actions?
Well, I'm not sure why you're calling him a vocal rebel. By definition, he isn't a rebel. He voted with the government,
well, he says
including
he is
voting
himself. They're his words.
Well, I mean, that's why the media has to stop using this term, Tory rebels. What happens is they tweet a lot.
What should we call him then? Come on, tell us what we should call him.
A government loyalist. He just voted with the government. I mean, he's not a rebel. How can you be a Conservative rebel if you vote with the government? That doesn't make any sense.
Well, he tabled an amendment at the House of Lords to get a meaningful vote. He's been a thorn in the side to Theresa May throughout the whole of the EU withdrawal. He's not a supporter, is he, particularly?
Can I ask you a direct question? Did Dominic Grieve vote with the government or not?
Well, you know the answer to that. You don't need to ask me that.
Well, no, I'm asking you. Did he vote with the government or not?
He did.
So then, is he a rebel? Yes or no?
But I mean, I'm not the expert here. I'm interviewing you, Owen.
Well, I know, but it's not about...
The point is, he did vote for the government, but he managed to get what he would say is a concession. And my question to you is, what do you make of his actions over the last 2 years? It's not about whether we call him a rebel or not. Well, you're just wasting time now.
I'm not wasting time. I'm objecting to the way the media is trying to beef up Conservative rebels which do not exist. We've got to be accurate.
They do exist because they had. There was a handful of people who voted against the government who are Tory MPs.
About four Tory MPs voted against the government. Dominic Grieve is not a Tory rebel. I don't know why we're having this discussion. You're quite right. And the reason I'm making that point is, look, Jacob Rees-Mogg today is crowing, basically. He said there's been no meaningful concessions by the government, and that's because all that's happened is parliamentary process has been restated. If the government table a neutral, if the wording of their bill at the end with the deal is neutral, then there can be no amendment, so there will be no meaningful vote. There has not been a climb down. And the reason as well, it's very important to say this, is, and I say this as someone who campaigned for Remain, there have been some in the continuity Remain movement who've directed their ire at the Labour Party, which keeps voting against, overwhelmingly, with few exceptions, overwhelmingly against the government's own plans, whilst again boosting this idea that there are Tory rebels who are progressive, like Justin Greening, who are there and going to save us from some terrible wrecking form of Brexit. That's not the case. And the fact is, you know, what we've ended up with is a situation where these so-called Tory rebels, who aren't rebels, have caved in. The government will now not be able, where we won't have a meaningful vote. And the reason this is so important is, what did we hear during the referendum? What was the battle cry of the Brexit campaign? Take back control. How on earth have we taken back control and parliamentary sovereignty if the elected representatives of the British people are denied a meaningful vote with the deal? But at the end of the day, what's happened is the government have kicked the can down the road. The Brexiteers, you know, including the honourable representative of the 18th century, Jacob Rees-Mogg, they will never be happy with any form of Brexit deal except the hardest and most destructive Brexit deal. And that, I'm afraid, is where we're heading. At the moment.
I want to bring Katy back in because we haven't spoken to you for about half an hour, it seems, Katy. Of course, this now means that legislation will be put in place when the UK leaves the EU next year. How is this going to play into Theresa May's hands when she heads to Brussels next week for that big EU showdown?
I think this is all a little bit about damage limitation. So the government felt that had they lost this vote and had the meaningful vote as first imagined by people that Dominic Grieve come into play, they would have very little bargaining power, because it would have seemed like Parliament could have directed their hands in the event of a no deal, and that would be a very, very soft Brexit. But ultimately, this is a very technical bill, and that was Theresa May's pitch last week, the night before it came to the Commons for its return. And she said, don't have issues with this one, because if you have problems with things like the customs union, there are plenty more opportunities for you to make trouble. So I think the real test, and I don't think Theresa May's negotiating position will be where she wants it to be until they've got the trade bill through, because that is where there is another group of perhaps not Remain rebels, perhaps would-be Remain rebels, who might vote against the government to try and force a customs union, which would be a big problem to her plans.
Do you think,
not out of the woods yet.
I want to put your money on the table here, Katy. Do you think she could lose that trade bill? Because many people thought she would lose this. She's managed to scrape it through. Could she lose that one?
Well, I think she keeps surprising us when it looks like she will lose. I mean, there's a lot of noise. I think there's a chance she'll lose it, but I do have a feeling that the pattern is she does put it in at the last minute and convince people not to rebel against her.
Owen, back to you. Talking of losing people, do you think we've lost the country on this? I mean, it's been parliamentary politics at its highest level, hasn't it, with the EU withdrawal bill? Many people have lost, really, what's been going on because it's very complicated, isn't it? Do we still have the country behind us on this?
I don't think most of the British public are particularly interested in the minutiae of what's happening, but the issue is the media has a duty to explain clearly what's at stake. And if we talk, for example, about the customs union issue or a customs agreement with the European Union, because, again, we don't really have Tory rebels, the government are offering two forms of customs partnership, which the EU have already written out. That the risk is, of course, if we don't have a customs union with the European Union, then you end up with a hard border in the north of Ireland, which risks the peace process, but also risks the economic future of this country. So there is a responsibility to explain clearly, yes, there'll be bills and amendments and votes and all the rest of it, and it's easy to get bogged down in parliamentary process, but we have a responsibility to explain what this actually means for people's everyday lives. And it's about the economic security of the people of this country. It's about the Northern Irish peace process, for example. But again, finally, you know, this take back control element, if Brexit I didn't want Brexit to happen, it is going to happen, is about reshaping British democracy, then we should have a wider discussion about what sort of Britain we will have when we leave the European Union. How will power be devolved to communities? What will we do about the existing constitution? What will we do with the powers we're supposed to take back, supposedly, from the European Union? What about, the vested interests that dominate this country? What about, the fact that the Conservative government haven't shown much interest, or they've tried to erode democratic structures?
Owen Jones?
And I think that's the debate we're not really having as a country at the moment.
Well, come back on Sky News and we'll have that a little later. Owen Jones, Guardian columnist, and Katy Balls, a correspondent for The Spectator. Thank you very much for your thoughts.